Some crimes don't end when the killer is caught. They don't end with a verdict. They don't end with prison walls. They continue inside the minds of survivors, families, investigators, and entire cities. These are the cases that didn't just take lives. They changed them forever, the moment everything changed. There is a precise moment in every terrifying true crime case when life splits in two. Before and after. Before the phone rang. Before the door was opened. Before someone noticed something was wrong. After that moment, nothing ever feels normal again. Time keeps moving, but the people inside these stories remain frozen, trapped inside the exact second when reality collapsed. This documentary is not about violence. It is about impact. About how a single crime can poison a family, reshape a community, and permanently alter the minds of those who survived it. Some of these cases were solved, some were not, but all of them changed lives forever. Case 1, the girl who walked home and never arrived on an ordinary afternoon. In a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened, a teenage girl left a friend's house and began the short walk home. She had taken that route dozens of times. Neighbors recognized her. Cars passed without slowing. Dogs barked behind fences. Nothing felt dangerous. And that is what makes what happened next so terrifying. She was seen halfway down the street. Then, nowhere, no scream reported. No struggle witnessed. No suspicious vehicle noticed. By the time her parents realized she was late, the window to save her had already closed. Search teams flooded the area. Helicopters scanned rooftops. Police knocked on doors that had been shut for decades. Nothing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into years. But the real damage was not the absence. It was the waiting. Her parents never moved. Houses, they slept with lights on. Phones charged, doors unlocked. Every unknown number felt like hope and terror at the same time. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays became unbearable. Friends slowly stopped asking questions. Not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say anymore. The girl's bedroom stayed exactly the same, because changing it would mean accepting something no parent should ever have to accept. Years later, when fragments of truth finally emerged, they did not bring peace. They brought something worse. Certainty, and certainty, in cases like this, destroys hope, but replaces it with grief that never heals. The family survived. But they were never the same people again. Case 2, the house that never felt safe again in a quiet suburban town. A family went to bed believing they were protected by routine, doors locked, lights off, alarm armed. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the house. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no shattered glass. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going to be. Why morning? The house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. The surviving family members would later describe the same thing. Not fear, not anger, but a deep, permanent sense of violation. They sold the house. They changed cities, they changed routines, but it followed them. Every unfamiliar sound at night, every unlocked door, every shadow in the hallway. Sleep became impossible without lights on. Trust vanished. Not just in strangers, but in reality itself. Because once something like that happens, you realize something terrifying. Safety is an illusion. And once that illusion breaks, it never fully returns. Case 3, the wrong place. The wrong second point. One of the most disturbing truths in true crime is how often victims are not targeted. They are selected by coincidence. They missed bus, a wrong turn, a decision that seemed insignificant at the time. In this case, a man stopped at a gas station late at night. Security footage shows him paying calmly, smiling at the cashier, walking back to his car. Seconds later, another vehicle entered the frame. That vehicle contained someone who had already decided to kill, but not yet chosen who. The encounter lasted less than a minute. The consequences lasted forever. The victim's family replayed the footage thousands of times. If he had left 10 seconds earlier, if the other car had arrived just a moment later, they learned something that haunts survivors of random violence. There is no logic.no, reason.no warning, just chance and irreversible loss. Case 4, the investigator who couldn't forget. True crime rarely focuses on the people who investigate these cases, but sometimes they are changed just as deeply. A veteran detective took on a case involving a child disappearance. He had seen violence before, he had seen death. This case was different. There was no body.no confession, no resolution. Years passed. He followed leads long after the department stopped funding the case. He kept files in his garage. He visited locations alone at night. Eventually, the case ended his marriage. Then his career. He retired early. Friends described him as distant, haunted, because some crimes do not end when the investigation closes. They follow the people who tried and failed to stop them. Case 5, the survivor who was never the same. Not all victims die. Some survive. And sometimes that is the cruelest outcome. A woman escaped an attacker after hours of captivity. She lived. She testified. The attacker was convicted. From the outside, the story had a happy ending, but survival came with a cost. She could not sleep in silence. She could not be touched unexpectedly. She avoided mirrors. Crowds triggered panic. People told her she was strong, but strength did not undo what had been done. Her life continued, but along a completely different path. One she never chose. The common thread. These cases are different. Different places, different victims, different outcomes, but they share one truth. The crime itself was only the beginning. The real damage unfolded slowly, across decades. Inside homes, inside memories, inside the minds of people who never asked to be part of a nightmare. And as we continue, the cases become darker, more disturbing, more permanent. Because some crimes do not just end lives. They rewrite them. When the crime is not what destroys you. Some lives are not destroyed by violence. They are destroyed by suspicion. By a name written in a report. By a sentence spoken too early. By a system that decides it needs an answer, even if it doesn't have the right one. In these cases, no one was hunted in the dark. No doors were kicked in at midnight. Instead, something quieter happened. A slow erosion of identity. A public unmaking of a human being. A life taken apart piece by piece, while the real truth remained untouched. Because when the justice system gets it wrong, it doesn't just fail. It creates victims. Case 1. The man who became a monster overnight on a weekday morning. A man went to work like he had for years. He had a routine. Coffee at the same place. The same route. The same coworkers. By the end of that day, he was no longer a person. He was a headline. A child had gone missing. Fear spread fast. Police needed a suspect. Fast. Someone remembered seeing him nearby. Someone else said his behavior was strange. Another person mentioned a past argument. None of it was evidence. But together, it became a story, and stories are powerful. His face was on television before he was formally charged. Online comments filled with certainty. People demanded answers and punishment. He was arrested in front of cameras. His family watched it live. From that moment on, it no longer mattered what he said. In the public mind, the case was already solved. Months later, DNA would exclude him completely. Another suspect would emerge. The real perpetrator would be arrested. But the damage had already been done. He lost his job. His neighbors avoided him. Strangers recognized his face and spat at his feet. Even after exoneration, he was never invited back into normal life. Because once the world decides who you are, it rarely listens when the truth disagrees. Case 2. Confessing to something you didn't do. There is a dangerous myth about confessions. People believe they only happen when someone is guilty. That belief has destroyed countless lives. A teenager was brought in for questioning. He had no lawyer, No parent present, no understanding of what was happening. He was tired, scared, confused. Interrogation lasted for hours, then longer. Investigators told him they already knew what happened. They told him witnesses had identified him. They told him cooperation was his only way out. Eventually, exhaustion replaced resistance. He repeated what they suggested. He signed what they wrote. And in that moment, his life ended. The confession was false. It contradicted physical evidence. It contained details fed to him during questioning. None of that mattered. Jurors heard the words, "I did it." He was convicted, sentenced, labeled. Years passed inside a system designed to break people. When DNA evidence finally overturned the conviction, he was released. But freedom came too late. His education was gone. His family was fractured. His name was permanently linked to a crime he never committed. And the most haunting part, he still blamed himself. Not for the crime, but for believing the people who promised the truth would save him. Case 3. The family turned into suspects. When a child dies under mysterious circumstances, grief is often replaced by something darker. Suspicion. In this case, a toddler died suddenly at home. Medical findings were unclear. There were no witnesses. What followed was not mourning. It was investigation. The parents were questioned repeatedly. Every inconsistency became evidence. Every emotion was analyzed. Too calm, too upset, too cooperative. Not cooperative enough. Friends stopped calling. Relatives distanced themselves. Online communities dissected their behavior frame by frame. The parents were never charged. They were never cleared. They existed in a permanent state of accusation. Years later, the cause of death would be revised. Natural, unpreventable. But by then, the family no longer existed. The marriage collapsed. One parent moved away. The other withdrew completely. Because even when the law moves on, public suspicion does not. Case 4. A name you can never escape. Some accusations don't come from courts. They come from the internet. A college student was accused anonymously on social media. No evidence, no police report. Just a post that went viral. Screenshots spread faster than facts. His name became searchable, permanently attached to a crime that never happened. He lost internships. He was asked to leave his program. Friends stopped responding. The accusation was later proven false. The post was deleted. But deletion does not undo memory. Search engines don't forget. People don't forget. Every job interview carried silent suspicion. Every introduction felt like a risk, because in the digital age, reputation is fragile and destruction requires nothing more than belief. Case 5. When justice needs a conclusion. Cold cases create pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. In a high-profile, unsolved murder, police reopened the case decades later. Public interest surged. Documentaries were released. The department needed resolution. They found a suspect. An old suspect. Someone who had once been questioned and released. This time, they framed the narrative differently. Old statements were reinterpreted. Memories were reshaped. Circumstantial evidence became central. The case went to trial. The jury wanted closure, so did the community. He was convicted. Years later, investigative journalists uncovered withheld evidence, alternative suspects, suppressed reports. The conviction was overturned, but the damage was permanent. The man had spent years imprisoned. His parents died believing he was a murderer, and the real killer, still unknown. The psychology of false guilt. What happens to someone falsely accused is not relief when the truth comes out. It is fragmentation. Trust disappears. Authority becomes threatening. Silence feels safer than speech. Many exonerees struggle more after release than during incarceration. Because prison has rules. Freedom has expectations. People expect gratitude, healing, closure. But there is no closure when years have been stolen. Only adaptation. The system does not apologize. One of the most disturbing patterns in wrongful cases is What happens afterward? No apologies, no accountability, no acknowledgement of harm. Exoneration documents are cold, clinical. They do not return time. They do not repair identity. They do not erase headlines. The system moves on. The individual does not. The families who were never the same. False accusations do not affect only the accused. Parents lose children to prison. Children grow up visiting correctional facilities. Spouses wait and age inside uncertainty. Even after release, relationships are strained. Because trauma does not pause. It grows. Silently. The lie that justice is infallible. These cases force an uncomfortable truth. Justice is a human system, and human systems fail. They fail under pressure. They fail under fear. They fail when truth is inconvenient. And when they fail, the consequences are not abstract. They are personal, permanent. Life-altering. The shift from innocence to survival. Many wrongfully accused describe the same moment. The moment they realized the system was no longer looking for the truth, only confirmation. From that point on, innocence became irrelevant. Survival became the goal. Why these stories matter? Because they change how we see crime. Not as a simple division between good and evil, but as a complex web of power, fear, error, and irreversible consequence. Because sometimes the most terrifying true crime stories are not about killers, they are about institutions. And the people they break. What comes next? In the next part, the focus shifts again. From the falsely accused to the deliberately hunted. Patterns, predators who refined their methods and changed how entire societies understood danger. Because some crimes don't just destroy individuals, they force the world to adapt. When evil does not come once, some crimes shock a family, some crimes shock a city, but serial crimes do something far worse. They reprogram society. They teach people new fears. They change habits. They introduce rules that never existed before. Lock the door. Don't walk alone. Don't trust strangers. Don't stop to help. Because when violence repeats with pattern and intention, it stops feeling random. It starts feeling inevitable. And inevitability is terror. The first time is a tragedy. The second time is a warning. In many of the most infamous serial cases, the first victim was treated as an isolated incident, a tragedy, an anomaly. Police believed it would not happen again. Communities wanted to believe it would not happen again. But when the second crime appeared, similar location, similar method, similar silence, something shifted. Fear stopped being abstract. It became personal. People started seeing patterns before authorities did. And that realization that someone was out there, repeating the same act, permanently altered how people lived. Case 1. The killer who taught a city to lock its doors. Before the murders, doors were left unlocked. Windows stayed open at night. Children rode bikes after sunset. After the murders, everything changed. The killer did not force entry. He entered permissionlessly. He slipped through open doors, unlocked windows, familiar spaces. Homes became crime scenes. Bedrooms became sites of violence. The city learned a lesson it would never forget. The threat was not outside. It was already inside. People installed locks, then alarms, then bars. Neighborhood watch groups formed. People stopped answering doors after dark. Decades later, residents could still describe the exact moment when trust disappeared. Not because of one crime, but because of repetition. Because once is tragic, twice is coincidence, but 3 times, that is a message. Case 2, the pattern in 01 wanted TOC. In another case, victims were separated by miles. Different ages, different backgrounds, different circumstances. At first, there was no obvious connection, but slowly, similarities emerged. Same day of the week, same type of location, same disappearance window. Investigators missed it, locals didn't. Parents began restricting their children's movements. Women adjusted routines. Entire neighborhoods became hyper-aware. The killer operated inside the cracks of daily life, public transportation, parking garages, common paths. What changed lives forever was not just the crimes. It was the waiting. Knowing there would be another. Not knowing where. Not knowing who. When the media makes a monster, serial cases change lives in another way. They create figures, names, nicknames, symbols. The media tries to explain the unexplainable, so it simplifies. It creates an image of evil. But that image spreads fear faster than facts. People stopped trusting strangers who looked similar. Suspicion fell on innocent people. Entire demographics felt targeted or blamed. Fear distorted perception. And the killer gained something terrifying: presence. Even when not physically there. Case 3, the one who blended in. Some serial offenders didn't hide. They blended. They had jobs, families, routines. They attended barbecues. They coached teams. They lived ordinary lives. When they were finally arrested, communities collapsed emotionally. Because the revelation wasn't just that evil existed. It was that evil had been familiar. People replayed interactions. Smiles became suspicious. Kindness felt staged. Trust suffered long after the arrest. Because once someone like that is exposed, people ask a dangerous question. How many more are there? The damage done to survivors. Survivors of serial violence are not just victims. They become witnesses to pattern. They live with the knowledge that what happened to them was not unique. That realization carries a unique weight. They weren't chosen. They were selected by opportunity, and knowing that means knowing it could have happened again, and again, and again. Some survivors describe guilt for living. Others describe fear of being invisible. Many never feel safe in crowds or isolation again. Because serial violence destroys not just safety. It destroys predictability. SE4, the city that never slept again. In one city, murders occurred exclusively at night. After the third incident, nightlife died. Businesses closed early, streets emptied, public transport usage dropped. People rushed home before dark. Years later, economists could still measure the impact, but the psychological damage was harder to quantify. People associated darkness with threat. Even after the killer was caught, behavior never fully returned to normal. Fear outlived the offender. The police pressure loop. Serial cases apply pressure like no other. Every new crime feels like failure. Public anger rises. Media scrutiny intensifies. Mistakes multiply. Leads are rushed. Suspects are misidentified. Sometimes, innocent people are arrested simply because the city needs the nightmare to end. And when pressure replaces patience, lives are destroyed, whether the suspect is guilty or not. Case 5. When the wrong person is caught. In a well-known serial case, police arrested a man who fit the profile. The city celebrated. Media declared victory. Families tried to heal. Then the crimes continued. Panic returned, doubled. Trust in law enforcement collapsed. People realized something worse than fear, false relief. That mistake changed procedures nationwide. Because the cost of being wrong in serial cases is measured in lives. HOW serial cases change childhoods. Children who grow up during serial crime waves grow up differently. Parents become restrictive. Freedom shrinks. Curfews appear. Strangers become threats. Entire generations internalize caution as normal. Even decades later, adults remember rules that no longer exist, but still feel necessary. Serial crime leaves generational scars. The myth of the END. When a serial offender is finally caught, people expect relief, but often, closure never comes. Victims still grieve. Survivors still fear. Communities remain altered. Some residents refuse to believe the right person was caught. Others fear copycats. The end of crimes does not mean the end of consequences. Case 6. the one that changed how we profile evil. Some serial cases changed law enforcement forever. They introduced criminal profiling, behavioral analysis, victimology. Because traditional methods failed, these cases forced authorities to admit something terrifying. Some killers were not impulsive. They were strategic, and strategy requires new thinking. The cost of learning that lesson was immense. When evil becomes studied. Serial offenders turned crime into a subject of study. Books, documentaries, courses. While knowledge increased, so did fascination. And fascination created another problem: glorification. Families of victims watched names of killers become brands. They're loved. One's reduced to footnotes. That pain never fades. The quiet aftermath. Years after the last crime, cities look normal again, but talk to residents, and you hear it. They still lock doors. They still avoid certain streets. They still remember dates. Because once fear rewires behavior, it does not fully undo itself. The truth about serial terror. The most terrifying part of serial crime is not the violence, it is the anticipation. The waiting. The knowledge that someone is active, and that knowledge changes. Lives faster than any single act ever could. Why this matters? Because these cases explain modern fear. Why people are cautious. Why parents worry. Why trust feels rare. Serial crimes did not just kill. They reshaped how the world moves. What comes next in the next part? The pattern breaks again. The crimes remain unresolved. No arrests, no closure. Only absence. Because unsolved cases do something even worse than serial ones. They never end. When a crime never ends, there is something uniquely cruel about an unsolved disappearance. No bodied, no verdict, no ending. Just absence. Unlike murder, which forces grief to begin, disappearance suspends it. Families do not mourn. They wait, and waiting without answers becomes its own form of punishment. The moment someone vanishes in nearly every disappearance, the story begins the same way: at a routine action. Going to work, walking home, running an errand, meeting someone briefly. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. And then, silence. Phones go unanswered. Messages remain unread. Time stretches. At first, people assume delay, then concern, then panic, and eventually the realization arrives quietly. Something is wrong. That realization changes lives instantly. CSE1. The person who left everything behind. In one case, a young adult left home for a short drive. Wallet behind. Phone battery LOW.NO luggage. The car was later found abandoned. Keys inside. No signs of struggle. No explanation. Search teams scoured forests, rivers, abandoned buildings. Nothing. Years passed. Friends moved on. Life events continued. But the family stayed locked in the same moment. They learned a painful truth about disappearance. Time does not heal uncertainty. It sharpens it. Every possible scenario becomes real in the mind. Abduction, accident, voluntary escape, foul play. Without answers, imagination fills the void endlessly. The psychology of ambiguous loss. Psychologists have a term for this type of grief. Ambiguous loss. It occurs when there is no confirmation of death, no ritual, no closure. The mind cannot process what the heart refuses to accept. Families oscillate between hope and despair. They preserve belongings. They avoid moving homes. They keep phone numbers active, because accepting finality feels like betrayal. Disappearance traps people between worlds. Not grieving. Not living. ASE2. The last sighting. Many unsolved cases are defined by a single phrase: last seen. Last seen at a bus stop. Last seen leaving a party. Last seen walking toward home. That phrase becomes sacred. Witnesses replay it. Investigators analyze it. Families obsess over it. In one case, a woman was last seen speaking to an unidentified person. The interaction seemed ordinary, no distress, no visible fear. That image haunted investigators for decades. Who was that person? What was said? Why did nothing seem wrong? Because disappearances often don't look like crimes. They look like normal moments until they are not. Case 3. When children vanish, child disappearances change communities instantly. Playgrounds empty, parents panic, trust collapses. In one town, a child vanished during daylight hours. No witnesses, no surveillance. The search became massive. Helicopters, volunteers, national attention. Nothing was found. The town never recovered. Parents stopped letting children walk alone. Schools changed policies. Generations grew up inside. Caution. Even decades later, adults who lived there as children remember the fear. Because when a child disappears, innocence disappears with them. The quiet torture of not knowing. Families of the missing describe the same experiences. They imagine birthdays. They imagine suffering. They imagine survival. They imagine death. All at once. Sleep becomes difficult. Silence becomes unbearable. Every phone call feels loaded. Hope becomes exhausting. And guilt becomes constant. Guilt for moving forward. Guilt for standing still. Guilt for imagining the worst. Disappearance creates a prison without walls. Case 4. The unanswered phone. In another case, a man vanished after making a phone call. The call was brief. Ordinary. No indication of danger. That call became the center of the investigation. Who was on the other end? What was discussed? Why was it the last known contact? Investigators traced the number. Dead ends followed. The phone became evidence, then memory, then symbol. For the family, it became something else entirely. A reminder that answers can exist and still remain unreachable. WHEN investigations go cold. Cold cases don't fade quietly. They decay. Files are boxed. Detectives retire. Witnesses die. Evidence degrades. The disappearance remains active, but unmoving. Families learn to live with the phrase, "There are no new updates." That phrase becomes devastating. Not because it means the case is closed, but because it means nothing has changed, and nothing changing is unbearable. Case 5. The sighting years later. Some disappearances offer false hope, a sighting. A rumor, a resemblance. Someone calls claiming they saw the missing person. Families react instantly. They analyze photos. They chase leads. They reopen wounds. Most sightings lead nowhere. But hope lingers and then collapses again. Each false lead deepens. Exhaustion. Because hope, when repeatedly broken, becomes painful. HOW disappearances change identity. Families of the missing stop being defined by who they are. They become defined by who is gone. They become advocates, searchers, interviewees, symbols. Their personal lives shrink. Their existence revolves around absence. Many describe feeling invisible except for the disappearance. They are not allowed to move on, and not allowed to stay still. Case 6. The missing without a trace. Some disappearances leave no physical evidence. No belongings. No digital footprint. No financial activity. Nothing. These cases are the most disturbing because they suggest total erasure. Investigators struggle. Families despair. The world feels unsafe because if someone can vanish completely, then safety feels temporary. The passage of time, years pass. Faces age. Technology advances. Sometimes DNA brings answers. Sometimes it doesn't. Some families get closure decades later. Others never do. The waiting becomes lifelong. The moment when hope changes. Families describe a moment, usually years in, when hope transforms. It doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes quieter. Less demanding. Less urgent. But never gone. Because as long as there is no proof of death, There is possibility, and possibility keeps grief unfinished. Why unsolved cases haunt us. Unsolved disappearances terrify us because they challenge certainty. They tell us that people can vanish without explanation, without witnesses, without justice. They remind us how fragile connection is, how thin the line is between presence and absence. The world moves on, they do not. Eventually, public attention fades. Media stops calling, search parties end. The world moves forward. Families remain suspended, still waiting, still listening, still hoping. What comes next? In the final part, the focus shifts again. From those who vanished, to crimes so devastating they changed laws, systems, and entire nations. Because sometimes, a single case forces the world to confront itself when a crime is too big to ignore. Most crimes disappear into statistics, filed, archived, forgotten. But some crimes refuse to stay contained. They spill outward. They expose weaknesses in systems that were assumed to be strong. They reveal failures that were ignored for decades. They force societies to admit something uncomfortable. What we trusted did not protect us. These cases didn't just destroy individual lives. They rewrote rules. They reshaped laws. They permanently altered how the world thinks about safety, justice, and responsibility. The moment society realizes it failed, in nearly every case that changed laws. There was a moment of collective shock, a moment when the public realized the tragedy was not inevitable, that it was preventable. Warnings had existed. Signs had been missed. Reports had been ignored. And once that realization surfaced, it could not be buried again. SC1. The child who changed how we protect children. In one devastating case, a child disappeared after repeated contact with authorities. There had been reports, concerns, clear red flags, but the system failed to act. When the truth emerged, public outrage was immediate and relentless. People asked questions no one wanted to answer. Why were warnings ignored? Why was procedure followed instead of instinct? Why did bureaucracy matter more than a child? The case triggered sweeping reform. Background checks changed. Reporting laws were rewritten. Agencies were forced to share information. The child's name became synonymous with protection laws. A life was lost. But millions of others were safeguarded afterward. Still, the family paid the ultimate price. Because reform does not undo grief. Case 2. The crime that exposed police failure. In another case, a brutal crime occurred in plain sight. Witnesses were present. Calls were made. Response was delayed. When the timeline became public, outrage erupted. Why didn't police intervene sooner? Why were calls dismissed? Why were assumptions made? The investigation revealed systemic issues: bias, complacency, lack of accountability. Public trust collapsed. Protests followed, policies changed, training was revised. But the damage to the victim's family was irreversible. They didn't want reform. They wanted time reversed. And that is something no system can provide. CSE3, the trial that redefined justice. Some cases change not laws, but legal philosophy itself. In a landmark trial, evidence handling was questioned publicly. Procedures once considered reliable were dismantled under scrutiny. Expert testimony was challenged. Forensic methods were exposed as flawed. The results sent shockwaves through courtrooms worldwide. Old convictions were re-examined, standards tightened, science was forced to evolve. But for those wrongfully convicted before the change, the revelation came too late. Their lives had already been spent behind walls. In a case changes how evidence is trusted. For decades, certain forensic techniques were treated as fact. Then one case shattered that certainty. Microscopic analysis was proven unreliable. Expert confidence was exposed as assumption. The justice system had been convicting people based on belief, not proof. Afterward, courts demanded higher standards. Evidence had to be validated, not just presented. The case saved future defendants, but could not save the past. ASE4, the disaster that rewrote safety laws. Not all true crime involves a single offender. Some involve negligence, corporate decisions, ignored warnings. In one catastrophic case, safety shortcuts led to mass death. Investigations revealed reports had been falsified, concerns dismissed, profit prioritized, public fury forced. Change, regulations tightened, oversight increased. Inspections became mandatory. Lives were protected afterward, but the families of victims carried something heavier than grief. They carried betrayal, because the danger had been known and ignored. When victims become symbols. In many of these cases, victims lose their privacy forever. Their names become legislation. Their stories become case studies. Their pain becomes educational. Some families embrace that role. Others resent it, because no one asks permission to turn tragedy into policy, and no law, no matter how important, replaces a person. SE5. The crime that changed how we see strangers. One crime shifted cultural behavior worldwide. After it, parents changed rules. Cities installed cameras. Strangers were no longer trusted. The world became more cautious, less open. That crime didn't just affect victims. It altered daily behavior for generations. People began locking doors that were once open, watching surroundings more closely, teaching children fear earlier than innocence should allow. The crime taught the world vigilance, but vigilance came at a cost. The invisible consequences of reform. When laws change, the public sees progress, but victims live with a different reality. Court appearances, media exposure, reopened wounds, relentless reminders. Reform demands storytelling, and storytelling demands reliving trauma. Some families describe reform as a second sentence, necessary, but painful. SE6. When one case changed an entire country? Rarely. A single case forces a nation to confront itself. In one such case, corruption was exposed at the highest levels. Evidence disappeared. Officials lied. Truth was buried. Public outrage reached a breaking point. Elections shifted. Leadership changed. Oversight expanded. The country redefined accountability, but the original victim never received justice. The system improved. Too late. Why these cases matter most? Because they reveal a brutal truth. Systems are reactive. Change almost always follows tragedy. Safety is often written in blood, and progress usually comes after irreversible loss. The people left behind. For every law rewritten, there are families left navigating a world that moved on. They are thanked, quoted, remembered, but they live with absence, with chairs that stay empty, with lives permanently divided into before and after. They don't experience reform as victory. They experience it as consequence. The final truth about true crime. True crime is not entertainment to those who lived. It is memory. It is trauma. It is unfinished grief. The most terrifying cases are not the ones with the most violence. They are the ones that force the world to change, because change means something went terribly wrong. Why we tell these stories. Not to glorify offenders, not to sensationalize pain, but to remember impact. To understand cost. To ensure patterns are recognized before repetition. Because forgetting is dangerous, and silence is permission. The lives that were changed, forever. Across this entire series, one truth remains constant. Every case left survivors, families, communities, investigators, strangers, people whose lives were permanently altered, not by choice, but by circumstance. The end, and the warning that these stories do not end with credits. They continue in behavior. In laws. In feared. In cautioned. In memory. Because some crimes do not end when the story is told. They echo forever.